Hello, everyone. On behalf of the Counselors of Real Estate, welcome to Taking AI from the 6 o'clock news to your desk. Thank you for joining us. I'm Bill McCarthy, CRE Global Chair of the Counselors of Real Estate and President of WPJ McCarthy and Company in Burnaby, British Columbia, Canada. The Counselors of Real Estate is a distinguished group of international accomplished advisors solving the world's real estate challenges. Experienced, innovative, and credentialed problem solvers. Counselors reside in 22 countries, practice in many more, and offer expertise in 60 real estate disciplines across all asset classes. Each has earned the prestigious CRE designation. Let's recognize our What's Next webinar series sponsors: Altus Group, Busak Real Estate, Equus Capital Partners, Ascenda School of Management, Harborview Electric, and WPJ McCarthy and Company. Thank you for your support. Before we begin, I'd like to offer each of you a free subscription to the Counselor's peer-reviewed professional journal, Real Estate Issues. If you don't already subscribe, please visit cre.org/rei. You're encouraged to utilize the Q&A feature should you wish to submit a question. Your participation is welcome, and we'll answer as many questions as time allows. I'm privileged to introduce today's moderator, Tim Savage, Ph.D., CRE, Professor and Director of the CREFC Center for Real Estate Finance at New York's Schack Institute of Real Estate. Previously, he was Senior Managing Economist and Principal Data Scientist for CBRE Econometrics Advisors. Tim was the subject matter expert for number 4 issue AI on the Counselor's recently unveiled 2024 Top 10 Issues Affecting Real Estate. To review all of the top 10 issues, visit cre.org/top10. Welcome, Tim.
Thank you. It's a privilege to be here among the counselors. I'm joined today as moderator by two professionals who deal with the issues that AI presents to commercial real estate, whether it's asset management or the nuts and bolts of measuring things in a building. The panelists today are subject matter experts in these areas. So I being an economist and the moderator, I'm going to ask Chris to introduce himself and give us a bit of his background. How did you become a data scientist?
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Savage. So it's really nice to meet everybody. Thank you, counselors. My name's Chris Liedtke. I'm the head of applied data science at Bensall Green Oak. I really started my career in data analytics about 20 years ago within the context of the U.S. military. So I was focused on acoustic intelligence, where the U.S. and I was helping build some of the systems the U.S. military was using to deal with the immense amount of data flowing off of our systems. So, after doing 6 years in the Navy and doing 4 combat deployments, applying this skill set, I went back to school, studied a lot of computer science and economics. Ended up becoming an economist, although most of my job was doing statistical modeling, and this is circa 2009, 2010, and I had a coworker who approached me and said, "You're like a data scientist," and this is the first time I had heard the term, although I'd been doing econometrics for years at that point. So I ended up jumping into the field feet first, went to graduate school for data science, was recruited by Putnam Investments out of graduate school, so was predominantly focused on deploying these technologies in the public equity research and quantitative analysis world. Predominantly working in the long-short hedge fund strategy space, but also informing our sales analytics vertical, as well as fixed income and global international equities. I spent about 4 years at Putnam, and then was recruited in 2009 to the vice president of research and strategy at Bensall Green Oak. And executive leadership got so excited about the art of the possible here. I spun off into my own group and joined into portfolio management because there was a deep cultural conviction that these skill sets need to be nested within investment management and really needed to be kind of in the trenches with the investment professionals, understanding the core problems so that we could effectively model around that. So I'm sure we'll get into a lot of the application of AI and data science at Bentall Green Oak, but I'll pass it back to Tim to facilitate the conversation.
Good. And Tom, my friend, you need no introduction, but I'm going to let you introduce yourself anyway.
Well, it's very kind of you, although I must say that unlike Chris, nobody has ever walked up to me and said, you sound like a data scientist. They said, you sound like you're a C+ political science major, which I was. So, but thanks for having me. I'm co-founder of Intelligent Buildings, and for 20 years, we've been providing management consulting for portfolio technology strategy and implementation management of that, and ongoing managed services like cybersecurity. So you can get a sense that we really focus on the buildings in the portfolio, but at scale for repeatability. We've done, we work with insurance companies, pension, REIT, government, military, healthcare, higher ed, anybody with lots of real estate, either projects or existing portfolio. A few fast figures, we've done 7,000 site assessments. We've consulted on $50 billion in new construction, and our active customers have 6 billion square feet of portfolio. All that to really say that I think what we'll enjoy talking about here today is, how can any technology be repeatable and scalable? I think most of the CREs in the audience here, science projects are cool and fun, but how does that ripple out into something that has real KPI impact?
So that's a good segue to begin to introduce the conversation. When I wrote, well, step back for a second. In our CRE top 10 issues, AI wasn't even on the plate in January of 2023. Advanced for months with the advancement of ChatGPT that thrust the phrase into the public lexicon. We realized as counselors and within the broader real estate public that we needed to talk about this. And I volunteered to write the short piece. I'm writing a longer piece. What I want to begin to frame the conversation around is the simple question I asked in that piece, which is, let's not talk about AI as artificial intelligence. Let's talk about its function. So let's not get distracted necessarily by the phrase AI and focus on what its function is. And both Chris and Tom have deep experience in applying what we might now call AI. I prefer to use statistical learning, but I want to begin to frame the dialogue today around that. What is its function? Because in economics and finance, we've been doing this long before I was born. We have concepts in finance that we use in real estate called modern portfolio theory, but what we have been doing this for a very long time. I want to start with Chris from the perspective of an asset manager. Given your experience in the military and given the military's deployment of these tools and techniques for decades, from the perspective of asset management, how does statistical learning, or AI, begin to essentially help you make decisions?
Yeah, thanks, Tim. So where I'll start here is just kind of framing real estate asset management through the lens of hedge funds and long-short strategies and public equities. Effectively, a few layers down in the problem set, these problems start to look very similar. So if you think about the United States, there's roughly 400 relevant real estate markets. If you explode that out to metropolitan and micropolitan areas, you're going to get close to 1,000. Then if you explode at one level outside of that, you get to the roughly 34,000 zip codes in the United States. So you're talking about an immense amount of locations to understand and analyze at once. And when you start thinking about, especially now as secondary and tertiary markets are becoming in vogue, scaling your acquisitions team large enough to understand the boots on the ground dynamics across these diverse geographies is incredibly difficult. So in the same way that we deploy these technologies in the public equity space to kind of hunt for the needles in the haystack, the interesting stocks that were behaving different, or hunting submarines in the Indian Ocean, you're trying to find that signal in the noise. So a lot of my friends had laughed at me when I transitioned to commercial real estate because they're like, that's not a big data problem. And now several years in, I strongly disagree with them. So our core real estate investment modeling data set is about 30,000 features wide. So imagine an Excel spreadsheet with 30,000 columns, and we're modeling a massive time series, trying to understand the supply and demand dynamics through time, so that we can develop conviction in those patterns to help inform our market selection process. So really, it's narrowing the strike zone for our investment professionals to help them be smarter and then more efficient with their time as well.
No, and that I think is a really important idea in the sense of the use of big data in commercial real estate. I've argued for almost 10 years that big data in commercial real estate will be wide but not long, and it's a question about feature selection. So let me pull in Tom. You are measuring things at the level of a building using sensors. This is not particularly new, though potentially underutilized. Talk a bit about the idea of the data that are being generated within a building in the urban built space.
No, it's a great question, and it's really unlike any other data environment, where a lot of times you have a CIO who can kind of have purview over all the data generated in an organization or industry. And in real estate, it is the most fragmented environment possible, because the mere ownership of the building might have 2 or 3 investors in it. So now who's driving strategy? And even if it's in healthcare or other types of organizations, you've got that, along with the fragmentation of the data is coming from 6, 8, 10, 12 different systems: HVAC, elevator, lighting, access control, video surveillance, parking, even irrigation. You could go down the list. All these systems have data in them, but they're each separate one, put in and managed by a separate contractor, who might report to a facility manager, then to a property manager, then to an asset manager. So I just want to give some context on the data environment here is nuts. One of the things we've been trying to work with customers to do for 20 years, and before AI, and especially for AI, is start thinking right now, when you're procuring something, building a building, changing a maintenance contract, start thinking about data ownership, non-proprietary systems, just all the little things, even in your maintenance contract and all these things, all the things that deleverage the vendors from a data perspective, just so that, as you said, Tim, even with sensors, and I'm sorry, your question was about sensors, but I was just making the point that there are literally millions of other data points that exist, and then sensors can be put on top of that. One other thing I wanted to just mention, when you said earlier, let's don't worry about what we call it. Given a 20-year perspective on this, there's frequently the wrong mentality or paradigm starting out. It was, this stuff is, whatever it is, this stuff is so cool, what can I do with it? As opposed to saying, what am I trying to do in real estate, and how can this help me do it better and more efficiently and with less risk, etc. So it was almost like you were looking for new KPIs. We're not looking for new KPIs. We're looking to get to them in a much more efficient and risk managed way.
And that ties back a lot to what I think Chris was saying. It's taking the paradigm of hunting for submarines to the paradigm of looking for high returns in portfolios, given risk tolerances. So I'm not going to focus necessarily on BGO. This was a slow process. It is a slow process in commercial real estate. maybe Chris, again, given your background, talk about the evolution that you've experienced in trying to use these tools and techniques, and how you engage with your stakeholders about what this stuff can do.
Yeah, a lot of fantastic questions in there. One thing I'll say is this renaissance that we've experienced over the past 20 years has been, truly remarkable. There's been incredible advances on the algorithmic front. So big tech, open sourcing a lot of their machine learning and AI algorithms for the, open source developer community to leverage. And I think that in conjunction with incredible increases in computational power and data storage and data availability, because data is becoming more and more valuable and monetized, so more people are generating it. I think this in conjunction with modern cloud platforms where you could host the data, where you could process it, where you could spin up an incredible amount of servers to solve hard problems. These are things that, if you wanted to do this 20 years ago, you needed a 50-person team of PhDs and you had to spin up custom infrastructure and hardware to make this possible. Whereas now, with the barriers to entry in cloud computing and some of these platforms being so low, talent and culture are really, I think, the differentiators within firms. So that's one thing I'll say. I think another thing I'll say is I was reading a Preqin article the other day, and hedge funds tend to spend about 7 times what alt funds spend on technology and research. So I think there's been a realization within the real estate asset management industry that we need to get up to speed, and we need to get up to speed quickly, because there's been a chronic underinvestment in this talent and these tools and technology. So I think that's been pretty profound. I think, specifically with the advent of technologies like large language models and ChatGPT, I think there's a realization that we need to get up to speed quickly, because we need to develop these lower level competencies before being able to deploy a large language model in an organizational context. So that's one thing I'll say. I think to your second question, Tim, a lot of this is around education. So I think educating investors on how to think about problems computationally through the lens of data science and analytics. It's a lens of the world that, unless you have training in it, it's not necessarily intuitive. So I think, we do lunch and learns, we do road shows, we show and tell. We spend a lot of time trying to understand the objective function, so the target of what the business people are solving for, so that we could effectively build an algorithm around that objective.
So I'm going to stay with Chris on this. As an asset manager at a large organization, you have access to very good data. My argument broadly, since my CBRE days, is there is an imperative to have data that are accurate, granular, and timely. And because of your role as an asset manager, you have a lot of that. How do you think about topics like garbage in, garbage out, and the role of accuracy when you are deploying your algorithms, especially when you're trying to get stakeholders involved in this?
Yeah, so we spend an incredible amount of time on assessing data quality and data cleaning, and then also just monitoring drifts in data over time. We'll get a different data set every month or every quarter from a vendor, kind of understanding how that underlying structure has changed of the data, and looking at across vendors to see where there's potentially anomalies or disconnections between what people are saying. So that's how we're kind of thinking about it. I mean, it is an interesting statement and a very interesting problem, because in public equities, you've got your data generation and capture mechanism is much different, because you've got publicly held companies have to generate Ks and Qs and data that is then captured and normalized, and effectively everybody in the industry is looking at the same sheet of music. Whereas in the alternative investment space, specifically in real estate, most of the data is fragmented, as per Tom's point, not connected, not public. So and I think we're realizing more and more as a firm. I mean, I think we had this realization years ago that we need to start being more diligent about capturing more data. They're just saying data is immutable, we're going to throw it, and we don't know how it's going to be used in the future, but we have a sense it'll be valuable. I think our conviction there has even increased over the past few months, because we realize, well, it's not just structured data or real estate data, but it's emails, conversations, contracts, retaining that natural language for utilization. Because I think looking forward 10 15, 20 years, I think it's hard to imagine what the potential use cases will be for activating the value of data and monetizing it. So I think this starts to put a strong imperative on shops to be able to start capturing as much of their data as possible.
And so just a quick sidebar, natural language processing is the core of ChatGPT. It's a particular algorithm that helps us to think about what is, at the end of the day, allegedly semi-structured data, which is things like texts or contracts that are not standardized in the way that an Excel spreadsheet that's capturing cap rates on a particular asset or in a particular market over time, which brings me back to Tom. In a sense, so Tom's dealing with really unstructured data. He doesn't even have the luxury of it being a text message necessarily. Help us think about the evolution of unstructured data and technology in the management and safety of a particular asset, of a particular building. How has that changed in the last 20 years?
Well, it's a very important question. It has been, and even more so now. So we talked about fragmentation and even getting access to the data. But when you're talking about disparate systems, like an HVAC control system has their version of an open protocol, but the lighting control industry has had another one, and the metering and electrical industry has had another one. So they're as open as they can be open, but open doesn't mean sane. So now I've got a data normalization process to do, and even a step below that, and I should get Chris to explain this, but the taxonomy even of data in the same format or protocol. So just a quick example, in one building, a thermostat may be called a thermostat. In another building, it's called therm. One, it's called T-stat. One, it's called set point. So it's all open, and I've got all the normalized data, but the taxonomy is all different. So there's a sort of a data normalization that has to occur. And one quick question, if I could, for Chris, before I play a doctor on TV, could you just describe LLM real quick for the audience? And I want to make a point then about buildings.
Yeah, so large language models are effectively they're computational tools that really came, like the underlying technology is has been birthed in the last few years. I think Google released their generalized transformer architecture paper, and the world was abuzz with it, and then we were able to deploy that really quickly. But it's effectively an algorithm that you could put in an incredible amount of text data, and it vectorizes that data, and then you could interact with it in a chatbot-like way. And it's interesting here, and maybe I'll go a little bit too get a little bit too nerdy here, but some of you are probably familiar with linear regression analyses, multiple regression analysis. There's a flavor of regression analysis known as a binary classification problem, or a logistic regression, where you've got ones and zeros, where rather than predicting a number, you're predicting a probability of something occurring. I mean, even though these things are exciting and they're new in some ways, and Dr. Savage, you'll probably call me on this, but it's a bit of a oversimplification. But these things are almost like very complex logistic regressions that are trying to predict the probability of the next word in a sentence. So in some ways they're very different and novel. In some ways they're just emergent out of technologies that had already existed.
No, that's very helpful. And that actually, the last part especially makes a point that I was going to say about in the buildings, is that I've been part of a debate recently where we said, okay, it's hard to get buildings out of data out of buildings, right? And somebody said, well, we don't even need that. We'll just use LLM. And I'm like, well, where's the LLM data coming from when not only is it hard to get buildings out of data out of buildings, but we've had real good information that most of the contractors' contracts prevent them from even getting the metadata of their own system out of the building. So sort of the owners have done a little something right there. So I guess the point of all that is, when we see the immense capability of AI in the just gigantic data sets and the LLM and those kind of things, we have to slightly shift a little bit when we're talking about the portfolio level. I don't think it changes the possibilities and the excitement and the efficiencies we can get from it. But going back to something I said earlier, the one thing any owner can do, no matter their sophistication, is stop buying proprietary things, start looking at data ownership, start changing your procurement and maintenance contracts. You don't have to know anything about AI. Just as Chris said earlier, you know the data is golden, and you better make it yours, and you better make the cost of getting it in the future at scale as inexpensive as you can, and that starts today.
And that's another interesting aspect of this, is to begin to have the conversation about the value of the underlying data. Something certainly the industry didn't think about 20 years ago. I mean, even 10 years ago, they basically said, well, we're just going to rely on Savage to do our forecasting for us. You don't need to rely on me. That was just an algorithm. What you have, if you're either a building or a large asset manager, is access to your own data and regularizing it, by which I mean making it able to talk to each other. So temperatures are being measured in the same units, that it's coming from a thermostat that is accurate within 2 feet. All of that's really important. Or on the asset management side, that you're measuring essentially your operating income in the same way. And that's a basic point I would make to the folks on this call, the counselors in particular. If you look at the evolution of analytics in commercial real estate, it actually started with the idea of saying we need to regularize data, right? We had a fragmented market in the 70s, and organizations like NACREIF were created to try to regularize data. So you could say, I can now compare 2 buildings. The net operating income in building A, net operating income in building B. I can begin to think about cap rates in these 2 different buildings. We're kind of in that role now, whether this is AI 1.0 or 2.0 or 3.0. We're still in the challenging phase of regularizing our data. And so I'd kick it back to Chris. When we think about generative AI, and I do want to begin to talk about ChatGPT, but talk more broadly about generative AI. What does that phrase, you're a data scientist, what does the phrase generative mean to you?
So I love the question, and I want to answer it, but you said a few things before that I really want to address because I think they're of vital importance. There's this incredible article, probably came out 5 or 6 years ago in the Harvard Business Review, is saying if your company isn't good at analytics, it's not ready for AI. And I think what that was really pointing to was the idea that there are lots of skill sets and ideas that need to be really embraced by organizations to be effective at doing these things. So and Tom alluded to a lot of these. So data governance, metadata management, ways of warehousing your data so that you could quickly extract information from it, rather than kind of texting people, emailing people, trying to do the data archaeology of finding where the data set exists, which I think is the norm in most industries. And I think maybe to talk about this on a slightly different level of the game, I think Dr. Savage, you're, I'm sure incredible at statistical modeling, but you don't necessarily scale very well. Like, if I throw you a few dozen problems or a few hundred problems or a few thousand problems, to build algorithms, building those takes a while. Maintaining them and updating them takes a long time. So if companies truly want to do this at scale, they need to be thinking about it with kind of a strong ethos of automation, and building that data supply chain such that the data is ingested, it's cleaned, it's managed in such a way that can then flow through the algorithms is a very non-trivial engineering challenge. So I think that's probably useful to talk about for the room. And then, I think riding on those same rails, you almost need a lot of these fluencies to be able to deploy generative AI and leverage these types of models. I'm sure there'll be vendor offerings in the next few years that make this, the barrier to entry lower. So maybe you don't have to, really build out these architectures independently. But I think it's where the world is going. So starting to invest in these architectures and technologies, I think, is of vital importance. So when I think about generative AI, getting to your actual question, Tim, I think about the accumulation of a data corpus and interacting in it in such a way that you're able to generate something novel from that. So maybe I'll start with a case study. We spend an incredible amount of time as an organization doing due diligence questionnaires for investors. We've done hundreds or thousands of these things. It's an incredible organizational bottleneck in processing these. And we had this idea, we have this massive corpus of data. Can we pull it together? Can we consolidate it? And then when we get new DDQs, can we use generative AI to answer very similar questions? I think this is a incredible use case. And there's a few other interesting use cases that we could talk about. And then another thing that I think is super exciting, but I think LLMs may have a hidden source of value in that, organizations are sitting on this massive amount of structured, unstructured, semi-structured data. I think, using LLMs to actually extract and structure data out of unstructured data is going to be in a really cool and emergent use case. And then, just be holistic and paint with a broad brush, I think probably 90% of the code my team writes is done with generative AI. So they're effectively LLM models that are sitting on top of technologies like GitHub, where massive code bases, and we're able to either have AI auto-populate our code, or we're able now to give it natural language instructions where we'll generate functions, loops, Python scripts. So I think the world is changing incredibly quickly, and it's very exciting.
So let me, again, just jump in for the audience's sake. Can you define the acronym quickly, LLM?
Large language model.
Right. And I agree with you. I had a student last semester who was running into some coding problems, and she actually asked ChatGPT to write the code for her. And when I teach these ideas at Shack, I emphasize that the corpus of knowledge is the corpus of knowledge. The languages change. I code in more dead languages than I care to think about. But that's one of the benefits of ChatGPT, is being able to generate these low-level, I should not use that phrase, generate the basic code, because we're not exonerated from thinking about the ideas, because ultimately we are trying to use this, which gets back to the first question. We're trying to deploy this essentially to make money in one way or another, which is how it was used early on in finance. So I'm going to jump back to Tom. Again, when you talk to your clients and they're saying, well, we'll just use ChatGPT to do this for us, we don't really need you. And that's again,
yeah,
it's a trick question, but
hey,
how
Tim,
do you react to that?
Let's stay out of my personal life, okay? Just teasing. So I think it's a great point, a good question, and I want to translate your point about Gen AI to my dirty fingernails word of the portfolio, and it really, I'm going to give you a little narrative, but it does beg the question, what some people, we said in our prep call, what some people call narrow AI sounds to me like just pretty good analytics. We've said in our space, this thing called fault detection has been around a long time, energy fault detection. So example of that would be, and I'm going to segue that into Gen AI. So if I was sitting there comfortable in the building, there's no alarms on my building automation system, everything seems fine. but hundreds and maybe thousands of data points could tell me, wait a minute, you've got a stuck damper that's open and it's bringing in too much hot air and you're wasting energy. That's pretty cool. The analytics told me that it didn't have an alarm, but it'd be even cooler if that then could actually create a work order to deal with that problem, right? Pretty cool. But it'd be even cooler if it knew not to create a separate truck roll because a service call is already scheduled for this coming Tuesday. And then it'd be cooler once again if there was a pre-scheduled maintenance call the following week and it pulled that up to that truck roll. All right, we're getting cooler by the second, right? And stuff's happening without me. But what if it also then told me if I keep applying this to other buildings, that I would need 10% less contractor capacity in next year's budget. And it can keep going on from there. So that's kind of an example how we go from just basic cool energy fault detection analytics. But if I keep building on that, now that leads all the way up to the boardroom. Wait, I need 10% less maintenance capacity in my entire portfolio. What else? Now am I going to start dealing more effectively with deferred maintenance and planned budget cycles? Wow, I mean, now we're really getting into something I did not know, and it is generating for me.
Right, and that's and that is certainly something that I think is very relevant here when we talk about even generative AI or generative statistical learning, is the role that domain knowledge plays in the application of these algorithms. So, you know, Chris, you used to hunt subs and then you hunted for alpha and now you're hunting for something else. Ultimately, that was driven by domain knowledge and not by the algorithm. So Chris is a data scientist. There's a famous so-called Venn diagram of data scientists, one circle of which is domain knowledge and the importance of domain knowledge. And I want to ask you, Chris, I mean, you bring a lot of domain knowledge, both from the perspective of asset management and computation. When you're trying to engage with stakeholders on what this is, what do you use more of, your coding knowledge or your domain knowledge?
I would say the domain knowledge across disciplines. So it's, you know, my effectiveness as a data scientist is some, you know, linear combination of my domain skills within commercial real estate as well as data science and being able to bridge that gap in such a way that the business people can understand the value in predicting something that could happen or describing something that is happening. So understanding the key drivers. So that's effectively how I think about it. I mean, AI, maybe to go back for a second and riff on the previous conversation, I'm so fascinated by this term. And, you know, bear with me here, I'm a recovering philosophy major, but you know, I think we first discovered how to compute a integral or you know, differential calculus doing derivatives in the it was late 1700s, early 1800s, something like that. But, you know, for hundreds of years, we could only do this thing by hand. But then as modern computers came out, it became computationally feasible for us to solve this problem. But then standing in that point of time as we approach the computer era, that looked like artificial intelligence. But now, you know, with the benefit of hindsight, foresight, that was just a computational problem. I think, you know, AI, the term AI is useful because it's indexical and points to this interesting suite of technologies. But I think, you know, when generative AI comes of age, when self-driving cars become feasible and we're all flying around in drones, I think in 200 years from now, we'll be looking back at what we called AI and we'll just be saying that was a computational problem. So I liked your framing earlier, Dr. Savage, that this is effectively a large conversation in statistical learning. So.
Tim, if you would pardon the temporary coup, Chris, can I ask, would you say domain knowledge relates to better prompt engineering, and does that help us, and can bad domain knowledge lead to bad prompt process?
Absolutely. And I think that's true on the large language model side, as well as the kind of statistical programmer side, whether you're forecasting or whether you're engineering a prompt. I think for the foreseeable future, there will need to be a subject matter expert in the loop kind of understanding the output, training the output. I mean, culturally within BGO, we often use the term human machine feedback loop, because we don't believe that the future is all human or all machine. The way that I talk about this internally is we understand the business people's paradigm and how they think about the world, and then we try to structure that into an algorithmic problem and feed it a lot of data, and then we analyze the output of the algorithm and then take that to the business, and they say, yes, A, B, and C is right, X, Y, and Z is wrong, or we don't understand it. So it's effectively allowing us to continuously strengthen our kind of algorithmic conviction, and it also just levels up the state of play and conversation within the firm, because it's amazing, from when I started to now, how many things that people thought were relevant and predictive in real estate systems that actually there was no statistical significance between this variable and that variable. So I think these things help not just quantitatively, but I think also just increasing the level of play within a firm.
Can you briefly describe or summarize what the prompt and prompt engineering is for the audience? Because I just discovered recently that it is one of the fastest growing new job segments, and it's not for super techie coders. Can you just describe what that role is in all of this very complicated technology?
Yeah, well, when you're engaging with a large language model, I think understanding how it works mechanistically and the types of language and structure and sentences that you feed into it, like they actually help determine the output of it. So I guess back to Dr. Savage's earlier point, it's kind of garbage in, garbage out, right? If you've got a non-subject matter expert or somebody who's not fluent with using a large language model, asking a large language model questions, the output that they're going to get is almost definitionally going to be not as good as somebody who knows what they're doing, who's also good at prompt engineering.
Yeah, thanks a bunch. And I yield the floor back to the gentleman from New York.
Well, I'm going to pass it back to you, right? So we've emphasized this idea of domain knowledge that I always just call it garbage in, garbage out, but the importance of framing the question in a comprehensive way, in a conceivable way, and then interpreting the results. I mean, this was economists have been doing this for a very, very long time, right? Our old line is never reason from a price change, because you don't know whether it was a demand curve shift or a supply curve shift, unless you have some sort of exogenous shock. So that's the domain component. And Tom, that is what I think you and the CREs bring to the table. I would ask the folks on this call, fire up ChatGPT, but do it on separate devices and ask it the same question. And then on the same device, wait an hour and ask it the same question. You will get different answers. And that, I think, is instructive when we begin to think about the role of domain knowledge, because essentially, Tom, your world was generative AI before we have called it that, because you were beginning to measure things that people couldn't measure, right? And you get a heat sensor alert and you don't know, you start to think about the engineering component of this, and it's sort of like, no, it's a stuck flue. I mean, it's as simple as that. So again, I'm going to kick it back to you.
No, you're exactly right about that. And the way you were describing that actually brings up a really important point for someone who might be overwhelmed by this, at least on the portfolio side. And that is, what are the roles of the owners versus the solution providers when it comes to this? And I'd love to get your feedback on the sort of back office stuff, because I think it's actually reverse. I think in the portfolio side, the marketplace is going to generate the innovation with AI. They're gonna bring the solutions to the building using AI, and they're gonna leapfrog each other. So let them do that and grab these things when we want to. But the role of the building owner, as we said earlier, is to get and own and expose and normalize your data. That's your role. And then let the marketplace innovate and tell you what they're offering to do with that data. and that's sort of in the data. But what I'm picking up from you and Chris is that on the back office side, it might be the reverse. You're really looking at your decision making. You're owning the Chris's of the world work for somebody to do this in-house. And so I feel pretty confident on the portfolio side. Innovation and solutions are going to come from the marketplace, and you just have to be ready to evaluate them. But Tim, what would you and Chris say about the like Chris's role, for example, is that's more of an in-house innovation and use of technology?
I would just note from the education perspective that the role of, if I may call you this, a Chris is expanding in the industry. Large asset managers are hiring chief data scientists or recruiting them internally to help them begin to answer these questions. And oftentimes they come from the domain knowledge side. So Chris has his domain knowledge of submarine hunting or trying to find alpha from a good location, which segues very naturally into asset management. And that's not necessarily true from a newly minted Ph.D. computer scientist who is terrific at the algorithm, at coding and developing algorithms and thinking about their performance, their accuracy, but not fully understanding the problem that they're meant to address. And so I'll open it up to Chris for his thoughts.
Yeah, well, I think maybe to offer, well, I 100% agree with everything you just said. I think maybe a potential simplifying framework could be the perennial build versus buy decision, or build buy hybrid. And maybe this connects the dots a little bit for the audience, in that I think there are going to be an incredible amount of vendors and startups that come to market with back office solutions, with finance and accounting solutions, with prop tech and property management solutions. So part of the exercise is being intellectually honest with oneself within the firm about what are we good at, like where are we generating outperformance as a firm, and what are the things that we're just not going to compete on. And you almost need somebody with a data science AI fluency to be able to separate the wheat from the chaff and say, these are things that are part of our core business that we need to, develop fluency in. These other things are not, so we should just not try to compete. I mean, when I was at Putnam Investments, our overall IT organization was shrinking rapidly as we were, adopting cloud platforms and off-the-shelf tooling to replicate what entire teams were doing there. But we were growing with respect to data science because developing a perspective on equity markets and stock selection is, our core business piece. So at BGO, we're constantly looking at different vendors and providers of these technologies and assessing whether or not we can do it more efficiently and if it makes sense to bring that in-house. I think, part of the reason this focus, this application of AI and data science started at BGO in the way it did is, part of our core competency is picking markets, picking sectors, thinking through correlation structures across markets, applying modern portfolio theory to our various investment products so that we can, outperform and kind of, outcompete our benchmark effectively.
Right. And that's another interesting point that I try to teach in class, which is you are not going to read in the Journal of Finance the best algorithms. There's no financial incentive for publication on that end of the world. I do think, though, that Tom, in your world, there is an incentive to try to publish best practices, to talk about case studies, as it were, and to say, okay, we thought it was X, but when we dug into it using the algorithm, it was not X, it was something else. And I think that's a potential value to the actual management of a building and the technology that goes into managing a modern building.
I agree totally. And along the lines of best practices, I think I would add the phrase use cases. Yep. So a lot of times people again, or just have a technology hammer and they're just looking for a nail, as opposed to saying, what are my use cases? And quick for the audience, a use case is not a system or a feature or a capability. A use case is almost always in a building interaction between multiple systems to accomplish something. Just quick example, then I'll turn it back to Bill. If you wanted a frictionless entry, you might involve the parking system, the access control system, maybe the video surveillance, maybe digital signage and ingress lighting. So frictionless entry would be your use case. And so the same thing with AI. What is the use case? Not just buckets of data flying around. Like, what is your use case to get outcomes out of it?
No, I think that's exactly right. So Bill has rejoined us. We tasked Bill with monitoring Q&A. Bill, I gather there have been some questions.
There's lots of questions. First, Tim, Tom, and Chris, thank you very much for quite an overview, a lot of detail, and so much to consider. And the first question is that we need you all to write for real estate issues so that we can have an expanded thought debate on this, because this is so timely. So we have a few questions in the time permitting, and I'll just throw them out, and Tim, I'll let you moderate them. AI and machine learning have long been a significant component of analytical work. ChatGPT is a small part of the ML/AI spectrum. The same excitement was there about a generative AI tools like Stable Diffusion image generation. So the question is, what changed the dialogue?
So Tim, which one of your students wrote that question, by the way?
I don't know. So I'm going to answer this a little bit and then throw it open to the panel. I think simply the ease of use of ChatGPT has changed the dialogue tremendously. Some of this older tech was not as open sourced and as easy to use. And the open source world is awfully good at marketing itself. And I think that has helped to drive the distinction. I don't want to say it's just marketing, because these are superior algorithms, but part of it is a form of marketing.
Yeah, I'll just add a quick thought to that. I think that's exactly right. And I just want to emphasize that, especially in the building, ease of use will be king, because in a building, the culture and the workflow you mess with at your own peril, right? So you don't just drop things into that kind of culture and workflow. Culture eats strategy for breakfast, as the business book says.
Another question, follow-up about the ChatGPT. Question is, in the cybersecurity context, is it safe to, quote, fire up ChatGPT?
I think I can give a simple answer to that, which is no. But I'm curious about Chris's thoughts, and I can supplement that simple answer.
Yeah, I would say this is an ongoing subject of debate at BGO. Microsoft and OpenAI release an incredible amount of documentation kind of outlining their technical specifics, their cybersecurity paradigm. If you read the current state of the documentation, they would have you believe that all of the data is being encrypted at rest, and so maybe to back up for a second, we're building a custom architecture within Microsoft's Azure, and there's a way effectively to house your firm-specific data within your private cloud and send data to OpenAI, so ChatGPT, via API call. So it's effectively a technology pipe that's going between your cloud and OpenAI. The short answer, and I agree with Dr. Savage, the short answer is probably not. I know there are settings as a consumer where you could go in, you could flip a toggle saying, I do not want ChatGPT to train on my data. I'm not quite certain from the consumer perspective what the data security paradigm is like there, but I would definitely lean on the side of caution there.
Yeah, I'll add a quick note to that, is that that's about the data, and then sometimes you might even call the encryption of that data and that kind of a topic. In the portfolio world, you worry about cybersecurity in terms of remote access to the data. And I should have mentioned this earlier, it's a whole other webinar, but in getting all this data and connecting and even your contractors, you must start with cybersecurity from a remote access perspective, which is abysmal in our industry. You can be all excited about getting data for AI when somebody hacks your elevator, and then you're going, oh, the data's not that important at that point. So again, maybe another topic, but cybersecurity critical at the portfolio level.
Another technical question: are there econometric forecasting model plugins for the ChatGPT?
Well, that's an excellent question. I do not have an answer to. I know I personally wouldn't rely on ChatGPT to do an econometric forecast, but I might say, could you write me a vector autoregression that could accomplish this?
Yeah, I would agree with that sentiment. So ChatGPT just released a enterprise product, ChatGPT Enterprise, and they say that they're enabling basic analytical functions. I'm not quite sure what that references, but I would agree. We use ChatGPT all the time, and tools like GitHub Copilot to generate code that helps us with that and helps us refine those things. But again, I think this is a strong case study of where you still need a human expert in the loop, kind of looking at the model diagnostics, understanding the output. Because if you've got some maybe somebody who's new to statistical modeling, throwing queries into ChatGPT and then just blindly running really complex models and then pulling those outputs to make decisions with it, it's probably not a good idea.
Okay, how does blockchain come into play or will come into play with regards to AI?
So I'm willing to jump in on that. I want to separate the technology of blockchain with its particular application of Bitcoin. I think blockchain as a technology can be pretty influential in commercial real estate as we think about things like contracts and conveyance, even appraisal. I'm just as mildly disappointed that WeWork seems to have damaged the idea of co-working. I'm worried that Bitcoin has damaged the underlying technology that's blockchain. I think it can be very valuable in commercial real estate without the application of a digital currency.
Anybody else on that one?
Didn't know if Chris, if that does that address immutability to some degree and some of the worries about data integrity?
Yeah, well, just to be like totally honest, I see them as being quite distinct technologies that should be thought about separately. Although I do think there'll be interesting ways that they kind of synergize and touch one another. I effectively think about them as separate disciplines.
Good. One last question, a little bit of crystal ball and balling, and also, we're in a world right now where we don't know what the office model is going to be like going forward, hybrid, work from home, et cetera, et cetera. With the rise of AI, how do you think that affects the brick and mortar? Are people going to want their AI teams working synergistically within a premise? Is it going to be more hybrid, work from home, or will it reduce the number of people in an office? If you could each just give maybe a minute on that, how you see this playing out, say over the next 10-year horizon.
Yeah, I'll throw out there because I've had some discussions on this, and one of the ways, and you mentioned WeWork, Tim, is that we went from fixed offices to then co-working. Now I can go to one of 3 places instead of one, including my own home. I think what AI is going to do in that realm is that every place, not just 3 WeWorks and my office where I am 2 days a week, but I'm going to bring Yelp into this, and I'm going to have bars and Starbucks, and then I'm going to cross that with where all my workmates are. And so it's really going to break open the fixed site, not just the office. I'm not clicheing about return to work. That's going to be one of them, but it'll really be talk about work anywhere. It's going to make that hyper efficient, and actually might even have us seeing each other more face to face when we get out of that linear thinking.
Tim or Chris?
Yeah, I have multiple minds about this. So I can't overemphasize the importance of real-time collaboration and kind of having in-person interaction between the stakeholders and the AI professionals. With that being said, I've been doing a lot of hiring over the last few years. Data scientists, AI engineers are extremely high demand, and they tend to be a younger cohort. And because they've got leverage in the marketplace, they tend to prefer work from home. So we tend to adopt more of a hybrid philosophy where we have our data scientists in when they're doing deep collaboration with business stakeholders and doing design thinking and things like that. But from an engineering perspective, it is sometimes valuable to isolate oneself from kind of the regular noise in an office. So we tend to oscillate on my team.
Tim?
So I'm just going to make the broader point that work from home as such was actually advancing prior to COVID. COVID accelerated what was occurring kind of as a natural economic phenomenon. And then we get into the hard business of saying, okay, well, we have a lot of office space and not a lot of demand for it. So how are we going to revalue this asset? And no AI is going to be able to do that.
Thank you, Tim, Tom, and Chris. That's just an excellent presentation. The convergence of AI in real estate and the impact and consequences for all real estate disciplines and asset classes are profound and evolving as artificial intelligence continues to attract considerable investment from capital providers and interest from all. Please look for announcements on upcoming webinars from the counselors of real estate, including an exceptional session on November 15th entitled Office Conversions. Until then, on behalf of the counselors of real estate, thank you for attending this session on what's next for real estate and the life experience. Thank you, panelists, and thank you all for participating. Have a good day.
Thanks.
Thank you.